moving on to the next session. It's a difficult airway, and we all know how challenging and a nightmare situation it is for all of us, and we dread it as much as possible. So to navigate us through this, we have Dr. Mary Mushambi. She would navigate through the difficult airway in obstetric practice. She's an eminent speaker and a good friend of ours. Dr. Mary Mushambi, she is honorary consultant at Leicester Royal Infirmary, Leicester, UK. She's an associate medical director in the University Hospital of Leicester. She's a DAS professor of anesthesia and airway management, and she has a lot of credits to her, as we've already seen in the previous slides by Dr. Anju Grewal. Over to you, Dr. Mary Mushambi.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much, Sunil and the organizing committee for inviting me to speak today about navigating the obstetric difficult airway. So I thought I was going to look at it from 2 points of view. So what I'm going to look at is firstly look at the unanticipated difficult airway and how to navigate that. And then I'm going to look at the anticipated difficult airway. So a pregnant woman with a known difficult airway. However, before I start, I just wanted again to remind ourselves of the awful statistics that are related to obstetric general anesthetic morbidity and mortality. As you can see from this slide, there's increased morbidity in the obstetric patient when you compare them to the non-obstetric patient, which includes increased incidence of hypoxia. We know already that there's increased incidence of failed intubation, of needing a front of neck, of pregnant women dying after an obstetric general anesthetic. And of course, we know that awareness is higher in the obstetric general anesthetic. So these are awful statistics and we need to address them. So how are we going to do that? Well, in 2015, when we published the obstetric difficult airway guidelines, this was our reason behind this safe obstetric general anesthetic algorithm, which was really to look at how can we avoid getting into trouble by improving patient safety. And this is a useful algorithm because it's useful as a teaching tool. It addresses both technical skills as well as non-technical skills such as teamwork, communication, planning, and decision-making. So let's look at this in just a little bit more detail. So if we look at the top there of the algorithm, the pre-theatre planning and preparation, and I'm going to look at some of these. I can't look at all the things in this top section. So let's look at intrauterine fetal resuscitation. This is a simple technique of improving placental perfusion by doing simple things such as switching off the Synto, changing position, giving the mother oxygen, and relaxing that uterus. And hopefully, if we increase the placental perfusion, we're going to buy some time because your baby might improve. We reduce the panic that we often get with the category 1 cesarean section, and we might even prevent needing a general anesthetic, which means we avoid getting into trouble. The other thing I want to deal with is this safety checklist. Now, we know already about the WHO safety checklist, which we all use, hopefully, but I want to introduce specifically the obstetric general anesthetic checklist, such as this, which is really designed to be used while you're pre-oxygenating the patient, and your assistant, or ODP as we call them in the UK, would read out this to you at the anaesthetist and you respond. And the kind of things we're looking into is, have you prepared the patient? Is your IV cannula working? Is the position correct? Have you remembered to give the sodium citrate, etc.? And then looking at equipment, is your suction switched on and under the pillow? Have you got the correct drugs for this patient? And have you remembered to have that second ampule of propofol should you have a difficult airway? And of course, have you prepared for a difficult airway? What is your plan B and plan C? And of course, what are you going to do if you fail to intubate this patient? Are you going to proceed with surgery, or are you going to wake the mother up? And of course, we know to do that, we use Table 1 of the Difficult Airway Guidelines, where we know that 7 of the 9 factors that we need to consider are there before you put the patient to sleep. And it's important to do it at this stage because by the time you have a failed intubation and you're trying to make this decision, it's going to be a stressful time with lots of human factors kicking in, situational factors kicking in. Therefore, do it before you get into trouble. So let's move on to the rapid sequence induction part of it. And I've included both our guidelines and your guidelines. So what can we do here to improve safety? Well, there's several things that these address, such as correct position of the patient. Don't ever do an induction with a patient lying supine. Put them head up because it improves airway management and oxygenation. Make sure your pre-oxygenation and apneic oxygenation techniques are good enough to prevent that woman become hypoxic. There's no doubt about it. We need to embrace this concept of peri-intubation oxygenation. It's absolutely crucial to prevent this pregnant woman becoming hypoxic. If we move on to induction drugs, propofol, there's no doubt about it, all the advantages of propofol. Therefore, we should be using propofol instead of thiopentone. What about muscle relaxants? Rocuronium has an added advantage because it's long-acting, that if you have any difficult airway, it's a lot easier to manage that airway compared to when you've got succinylcholine, when you're trying to deal with the difficult airway and your succ is wearing off. And of course, we mustn't forget mask ventilation. Gentle mask ventilation is useful to prevent the woman becoming hypoxic. So let's move on to laryngoscopy. How can we make that safe? Well, the aim of laryngoscopy is to try and maximize successful intubation at that first attempt. So what can we do? Well, your choice of laryngoscope is important, and I'll look at that in the next slide. But you can also do other things. If at that laryngoscopy, your first laryngoscopy, you find that your view is not good, then you can maximize that view by reducing or removing your cricoid pressure, using external laryngeal manipulation, reposition the head and neck, and of course use a bougie. And only if you struggle and still can't intubate at this point, then make sure you oxygenate the patient again and have your second attempt. And make sure again your second attempt is to try and maximize successful intubation. And the third attempt is only really by a very senior, experienced colleague who should be doing that. So we really try and avoid third attempt at intubation in order to avoid traumatizing that airway. So let's look at laryngoscopy, laryngoscopes. There's no doubt now that video laryngoscopes give you better laryngeal views. You have higher success rates. We know that we've used video laryngoscope to rescue a failed intubation when you've used direct laryngoscopy. Video laryngoscope are excellent teaching tools so you can see what your trainee is doing. And of course, it has an impact on human factors because everybody can see and we can communicate better. And therefore, it is high time we should be using video laryngoscope as our first line laryngoscope. And there's no doubt that COVID has taught us the advantage of video laryngoscopes. And therefore, we shouldn't go back. We should go forward and use video laryngoscopes in all intubations. So let's move on to the next part. You've done your intubation. Hopefully, it's successful. So that takes us to your general anesthetic and, of course, planning for a safe extubation because things can still go wrong at extubation. Now, hopefully, that will happen. But sadly, sometimes things don't go so well, and then you end up having a failed intubation. Now, before I move on to the failed intubation algorithm, I want to come back and re-emphasize again the reason behind trying to avoid failed intubation. And this is the reason. This is a paper we published in 2017 where we looked at the morbidity in pregnant women who had a failed intubation compared to pregnant women who had an uneventful general anesthetic. And as you can see, the statistics, again, are showing worse morbidity in the patients that had failed intubation. Look at the chances of becoming hypoxic, 71% versus 2%. The lowest oxygen saturation, 40% versus 84%. There's a higher incidence of aspiration, and there's a higher incidence of the neonatal ITU admission. So these are the reasons we're trying to avoid a failed intubation. Sadly, we may not be able to avoid it, and it happens. So we need to manage it appropriately. And your priorities are oxygenating that mother with either a face mask or a supraglottic airway device, and preferably a second generation supraglottic airway device. And then you need to communicate with your team, call for extra help. And of course, we need to make decisions depending on whether you're able to oxygenate the mother or you're not oxygenating the mother. And if you manage to oxygenate the mother, then you're going to the pause there where you've got to decide, are we going to proceed with surgery or am I going to wake this mother up? And of course, once you've made that decision, we've given guidance on how to actually wake the mother up and what to do after you've woken them up, or how to proceed with surgery. Now, we know that 70% of the time, anesthetists are proceeding with surgery when they've had failed intubation in obstetrics. Therefore, we need to emphasize how to manage this. And to do so, I've put a summary here of what we should do when you're proceeding with a general anesthetic after you've had a failed intubation. So, maintain anesthesia. You want to make sure the patient is paralyzed and you're ventilating the patient. You want to have a second generation supraglottic airway device. And because you don't have a secure airway, you must always anticipate that you might lose that airway. Therefore, make sure you've got your frontal neck equipment ready. You know where your cricothyroid membrane is, but you can even use ultrasound to mark where it should be. What do you do about cricot pressure? Well, it's optional. Most likely you want it off anyway because it might compromise your ventilation. But you still need to take precautions to prevent aspiration. And by that, one of the things you can do is reduce the obstetricians applying fundal pressure, because you can get regurgitation when they do that. And then, of course, remember, call your neonatal team, because the chances of that baby going to the neonatal unit is very high. So hopefully you'll manage to oxygenate the patient, but very occasionally you fail to oxygenate the patient, and therefore you're going down the route of the can't intubate, can't oxygenate the patient. And it takes us to this algorithm. And of course, your priorities are still the same. Oxygenation, communication with your team, call for extra help, and of course, decision-making of what are you going to do if you manage to oxygenate the patient and manage to do a successful front of neck, or if you fail. And of course, the things you want to do is, firstly, exclude laryngeal spasm, because that might be what's causing the can't intubate, can't oxygenate. So make sure your patient is paralyzed before you declare a can't intubate, can't oxygenate. You then want to do your front of neck using whatever technique is recommended in your country. In the UK, it's a surgical front of neck. But if you fail to oxygenate this woman at this stage, you must remember you need to do the perimortem cesarean section as part of the resuscitation. So that's all I'm going to be talking about as far as unanticipated difficult airway. I'm now going to move on to how to approach a pregnant woman with a difficult airway. And this is really just a summary of a paper we published last year looking at anticipated difficult airway in the pregnant women. And what we did was reviewed 158 published cases of pregnant women who had a difficult airway. And what we found overall was that the technical skills required to manage a pregnant woman with a difficult airway were very similar to the non-pregnant patient. But what was different was the decision-making process. And therefore, we put together some decision aids to help with this process, and I'll be able to share these with you. So what makes the pregnant woman different to a non-pregnant woman when they have an anticipated difficult airway? Well, this is a list of all the things that makes them different. First is to remember, very obvious, you've got 2 patients to consider, and you've got a time scale of only 9 months or less to do it. That baby can be delivered at any time of day or night, or at any gestation, including preterm delivery. The urgency of surgery can vary from a planned elective cesarean section to a category 1 cesarean section, which can happen in about 5% of all elective cesarean section. So you need to plan for that. We also know that delivery suites tend to be remote from the main theatre. So quite often help will take a bit longer to arrive. So we need to plan that. Every pregnant woman has potential to bleed either antenatally, intrapartum, or postnatally. So therefore, even though we may want to do everything under regional anesthetic if we can, you may be forced to give a general anesthetic. So you can't exclude that forever. You may also need to deliver the baby before the airway pathology has actually been treated, because it might not be appropriate while they're pregnant, or the mother might refuse to have treatment while she's pregnant. You may also have obstetric physiological changes such as preeclampsia, which can impact on airway and make it even worse. So just to give you some idea of the kind of cases that I'm talking about. So this was a lady that I had to look after who had Klippel-Feil syndrome. Now, one of the things we found with patients that have anticipated difficult airway in pregnancy and congenital condition is that quite often they had a difficult airway as well as a difficult back, because they often had scoliosis. So it makes the airway and the regional anesthetic very challenging. So it makes it even more difficult. The other problems that you can get in maternity, in obstetric patient, is high BMI. At what level of BMI do you feel that I'm happy to face this woman in the middle of the night for a category 1 cesarean section? I had to deal with this woman who weighed 223 kilograms on a Saturday morning for an obstetric emergency delivery. You have to plan for this. And then I mentioned earlier on that you can get conditions where the mother may refuse to be treated until the baby is delivered. And this was a case of a lady we had who was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma early in her pregnancy. She was offered treatment and refused. And in fact, she refused follow-up and disappeared from follow-up until at 33 weeks, she presented to us with stridor, and she was still refusing treatment. And we had to do her surgery, deliver her baby before we could treat her. And lastly, you can also have, as I mentioned earlier on, obstetric physiological changes impacting on the airway. And this can happen as an emergency with very little time to plan. So this was a lady who presented at 36 weeks, having had multiple eclamptic seizures, bitten her tongue, and this is what her airway looked like. And on top of that, she had low platelets. So how would you deal with this problem if you were the anaesthetist on call? Well, they did a spinal anesthetic, which is fine, but what would you do if this lady started bleeding intraoperatively and needed general anesthetic? So you need to plan for this. So I'm now going to take you through just to look at some of the decision aids of how do we approach a pregnant woman with a difficult airway. So I'm going to start with this, which is an overview. It looks busy, but I'll go through it for you. So what you need to do at the top there is to identify these women who have a difficult airway. And we have to rely on our obstetric colleagues and our midwifery colleagues to refer these patients to us. But they also need guidance of the type of cases that we want them to refer to us, which are listed there. When the patients then come to our clinic, we then do a thorough airway assessment where we then decide, are we going to have a multidisciplinary meeting with our colleagues to decide the mode and timing of delivery? Because we may decide we're going to allow this woman to go for labor because we're happy with it. Or we might bail out and decide we're going to bail out and have an elective cesarean section for airway reasons. And if we go for an elective cesarean section, we then have to decide, are we going to go for a regional anesthetic? Knowing that if you have a regional anesthetic, there's a small chance you may need to do an intraoperative general anesthetic for whatever reason, such as bleeding. Or do we bail out and go for a general anesthetic? If we go for a general anesthetic, do we do an awake airway or do we go for an asleep airway? Now, one of the most difficult decisions to make is this point of, do we allow this pregnant woman with a difficult airway to go for labor or for an elective cesarean section? And to do that, we put this decision aid 1, where we need to decide at the top there, can safe airway management be achieved in this woman out of hours? And to make that decision, we have to look at three things. The first one is the clinical characteristics of this patient, the obstetric characteristics, and the anesthetic, which includes airway or a bag, how easy is it to do a regional anesthetic. And then we need to know, do we have the equipment on our labor ward to deal with this airway challenge and this woman? Do we have the personnel to look after this woman at night, 7 days a week? If we're happy that we can deliver safe airway management in this patient, then of course we can allow the woman to go for labor. We might even consider to induce the woman so that she's having an induction on a day that we have the staff available, equipment available, everything. But that labor needs to be actively managed. Make sure you've got an epidural that's working, you communicate with your team, make sure she's not eating, and also monitor the progress of the labor so that to avoid the need of a category 1 cesarean section. That's really what you're trying to avoid. However, if you think we cannot deliver safe airway management out of hours, then we are heading for an elective cesarean section for airway reasons. Now, this decision-making of whether to go for labor or elective section is difficult. How do you do it in practical terms? Well, you could actually just do by having a tabletop discussion with your colleagues. But you can also do it in a more structured way, which is using this decision tree analysis, which was published by James Bamber. And what they did is that they put together a table to decide what would happen if you allowed this woman to go for labor or for elective cesarean section. And then they put a probability of what is a possible outcome for each of these. So what are the chances of a woman who you give labor to go and deliver successfully vaginally? Or if they go for emergency cesarean section, what are the chances of things going right or things going wrong? Similarly with elective cesarean section, what are the chances of a successful regional anesthetic, or if you have a general anesthetic, the chances of failed intubation, etc. And the estimates for these can either be for published data, from local data, or expert opinion. As you can imagine, there's advantages and disadvantages to this. The advantage is that it quite clarifies the whole clinical decision options. You can see them there. It gives you the options, the outcomes, and the risks, which are useful not only for your colleagues, but for your patient as well, because they can see what are the chances of things going right or going wrong. But there are disadvantages in that this outcome data is not readily available for every step. For example, if you look at the successful regional anesthetic there, we can have successful figures for a spinal anesthetic, but we don't have successful spinal figures, statistics, for somebody who has scoliosis or has got an abnormal back. So these figures, the data is not readily available, but it's something to aspire to. To give you just an example of how important it is to really have a very detailed discussion and come to the right conclusion, I'm going to share with you this case which was published, which was a lady who had subglottic stenosis and had stridor. So she had subglottic stenosis, very significant narrowing, had a low-lying placenta and preeclampsia, and the low-lying placenta was not covering the os. So they had a multidisciplinary discussion, and they decided that they were going to allow this woman to labor with an early epidural. Okay, that's their decision. So what happened on the night? As it happens, it happened in the middle of the night. Patient delivered with forceps delivery. Not surprisingly, she had a major postpartum hemorrhage, and she also had a second-degree tear. Now, fortunately, they got away with it, but this could have gone wrong, terribly wrong. Because what would you have done if you were the anaesthetist that was on call on this night and this woman needed a general anesthetic because she was bleeding? I wouldn't have wanted to be that anaesthetist. So coming back to this decision aid one, there's another stage I want to just discuss in a little bit more detail, which is this. This is that choice of making an elective cesarean section in this woman with a difficult airway for airway reasons, which means is the anaesthetist really pushing for this. Now, we've been sort of challenged with this and saying, should we really be doing this? Well, when we looked at the 158 cases that we had, there were 52 cases who had an awake fiber optic intubation, and 17 of those, an elective cesarean section was chosen as a mode of delivery for specifically airway reasons. And I'm going to show you a case, share with you a case that really shows you how important it is occasionally for us as anaesthetists. It may not happen often, but to push this. So this was a lady who had multiple pterygium syndrome. You can see she had a difficult airway. She also had spinal rods, so difficult back. The obstetrician had seen the patient and decided they wanted a vaginal delivery. Fortunately, anaesthetists heard about this, and at 33 weeks, they called for a multidisciplinary team meeting, and they made a final decision that she had to have an elective cesarean section for airway reasons. And I'm sure you'd agree with me, that's very reasonable. So let's see what happened on the day. So I'm going to point out first that at the top there, I know the authors of this paper, and they were all experienced obstetric anaesthetists and experienced airway anaesthetists. And this is what happened on the day. So they tried a spinal, it failed. They tried oral awake fiber optic intubation twice, it failed. They tried a nasal intubation, it failed. They tried awake video laryngoscope with a Pentax, it failed. They tried awake video laryngoscope with a GlideScope, it failed. And eventually they did manage with an awake fiber optic, but with a patient lying on this side. But it took a long time. So had you followed the obstetrician's decision of allowing this woman to labor, what would you have done if this had been a category 1 cesarean section? I rest my point. So let's just come back to this decision aid overview again. And the point I want to just address is this point where you need to make that decision. So you've made a decision, you're going for an elective cesarean section. Now you're going to decide, are you going to go for a general anesthetic or regional anesthetic, knowing that if you do a regional anesthetic, you may need to put this patient to sleep. So you need a plan. How do you make that decision? It's not easy, but I'm going to share with you a case that really illustrates a way that you can reassure yourself of what you might do. So this was a case that was published by Martin Dresner in the 1990s, and it was a lady with Klippel-Feil syndrome, very similar to my lady that I had. So what they decided was that they would do an awake laryngoscopy under topical anesthesia, and they used a Macintosh blade, but nowadays you'd use a video laryngoscope, and had a clear view of the glottis. So they knew that if they needed to intubate this patient, they would be able to intubate the woman. So they did the cesarean section under regional anesthetic. In fact, they used a spinal catheter, knowing that if they need to give a general anesthetic intraoperatively, they would be able to intubate this woman. So just to summarize, the approach of management of pregnant women with a difficult airway. We need to identify these women correctly. We need to have a multidisciplinary discussion with the decision of how to deliver these women. And we need to involve the patient. They should be involved in this decision. And our plan should be a robust plan to deal with the worst case scenario of a preterm delivery out of hours for a category 1 cesarean section. So I hope that I've covered enough on unanticipated difficult airway management and anticipated difficult airway in the pregnant woman. And I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Dr. Mary, that was fantastic navigation, a real world authority on airway and obstetrics. I don't know whether there are any questions, but it was so lucid and fantastic presentation. Are there any questions, Angelina? For Dr.
No, I don't think so. There are many questions. Just wanted to ask you, how often have you encountered where you have had to use a second generation supraglottic in a cases of difficult scenario?
Fortunately, I've not had to do that in my life. I've never had a failed intubation in obstetrics. And I can say that now because I've retired. So I don't have, I hopefully one time I have to do it. But it has been used in my hospital. And in fact, we've got a very interesting case where it was used and the airway had really swollen up. And at the end of the cesarean section, instead of the patient was going to ITU because they'd been bleeding, and instead of changing the supraglottic airway device to a tube, they left the supraglottic airway device in situ, send the patient to ITU with the plan that is going to be removed. Unfortunately, ITU was busy and it was about 48 hours before anything was done. And eventually they did. But when the patient woke up, she had nerve palsies, damage from the eye gel. So it'd been left in for too long against the guidance of the supraglottic airway device. So if you do use a supraglottic airway device and you need to go to ITU, you have to remove it using an Aintree intubating catheter as part of the process of intubating the patient.
Dr. Mary, there was a parallelly debate going on in Hall B, pro-con debate on supraglottic airway devices, routine use in pregnancy, pro versus con. And at least about 32% of respondents agreed can be used routinely. What is your say?
My say is that, and you know, I've written an article on this, is that I think it's something that is going to happen, but we're not ready yet. And the reason we're not ready yet is because we need to be able to choose the kind of patients we're going to be doing it in. And we don't have a robust system of how to choose a patient based on the body BMI, and any assessment of the airway and gastric content assessment. And also, which is the best supraglottic airway device? Which is the best anesthetic? Do we allow the patient to breathe spontaneously or do we paralyze them? So there's still a lot of unanswered questions. But I think because, you know, we now already accept that if you have a failed intubation, you use them. And I think in a failed intubation scenario, there's no question about it. But elective, I think we're not quite ready yet. But I can see it in the future that I'm sure it will happen. I mean, if you look at the papers, a lot of them are from China. And there's some units that I say they're actually doing it. And some of it, they say it's a patient choice. The patient want to have the supraglottic airway device. Yeah.
I think no more questions, Dr. Mary. Thank you very much again.
I just want to just apologize. So my slides, the pictures were not very clear because I recorded it and sent it. So the quality didn't come through as well as it should have been. So I apologize for that.
Not at all. It was lovely to have you with us. Thank you so much for being with us. And
thank you.
Yeah, we'll move on to the next session.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Second. There's one question, I think, madam. I think.
Yeah.
Same thing, I think. Or would you recommend to continue cesarean section if supraglottic airway device was used in can't intubate, can't ventilate situation, elective cesarean section?
Yes, if you think the conditions, you know, if you look at the table 1 and the patient's BMI is not very high, and the conditions are in favor of a secure airway, a reasonable airway, I probably would. And again, if you look at the statistics, the 70% who were proceeding with the general anesthetic after failed intubation, that included both emergency and elective cesarean sections.
And would you recommend in parturients with difficult airway, a routine localization of cricothyroid membrane and mark it before you induce for some reason giving GA?
Yeah, and it's actually on our guidance. We actually have, I didn't have time to cover that, but on the one that says about general anesthetic, it says identify your cricothyroid membrane. Yeah. And
there is specifically a question from Dr. Durai Swami. How would you manage a 224 kg parturient on a Saturday night?
On a Saturday, I called a friend. You call a friend. These are not cases you do on your own. But fortunately, we had a robust plan and we did it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. So Angelina will move on to the next session.